Hello and welcome to Verso Live, a new virtual event program to celebrate 50 years of Verso books. All events are streamed live and will be available to watch again after the event has finished via our YouTube channel. Questions and comments can be made via the YouTube chat box. We hope you enjoy the event.
Hi, and welcome everybody to this Verso event. I'm really pleased to see you there. My name is Christine Murray. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Developer, which is a magazine that talks about the spaces between the buildings. And it's really my pleasure to be hosting this event with Shiromi Pinto, author of Plastic Emotions, and with Leslie Kern, authors of Feminist City. So welcome both of you. I'm really excited about talking to you about these books today.
Thank you. Hello.
So I know that it often can seem unusual to be comparing a novel or a work of fiction, even a fictionalized account of a true person, and a nonfiction book about the city. But I think there are lots of really interesting commonalities. I'm going to kick off, though, just asking you to talk a little bit about your work. So Shiromi, if you're okay to go first and just discuss a little bit about your intentions around the book and really maybe set the scene for this event today.
Hi, so I'm Shiromi, and I'm author of the novel Plastic Emotions, which is right here. And the book is inspired by the life and work of Minette de Silva. Minette de Silva was a woman of so many firsts, really. She was the Sri Lanka's first modernist architect. She was the first Asian woman to be made an associate of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And she was also the first to articulate a particular vision of modernism that, or when I say modernism, I mean modern architecture, that really departed from that sort of dominant European interpretation of it. So really quite an extraordinary woman. She also had an extraordinary personal life and knew all the great and the good. The novel itself is set just after the Second World War and kind of runs to the mid-1960s. And the principal kind of framework of the novel is the relationship that she had with Le Corbusier, who, as we all, I suppose, accept, was the father of modern architecture. And indeed, de Silva actually did have some kind of relationship with her. I cast that relationship as something a bit more intimate than anyone really knows. We don't really know what the nature of their relationship was, but we do know that they were very good friends. But the book itself kind of goes beyond that. As I said, their friendship and relationship is the sort of framework, but really the book is looking at the whole idea of, or the kind of idealism that architects at the time were holding on to and believed. They believed that they could change the way people could live, and they had that perfect opportunity in this sort of newly independent nation. Here, for de Silva, it was Ceylon, as it was then known, and for Le Corbusier, it was the capital city, this modern capital city of Chandigarh in India. But as the novel progresses, you see that idealism slowly erode and kind of succumb to various, not just kind of a loss of this kind of romantic view of what a new nation and building a new nation could be, but also the realities, certainly in Ceylon, of the tensions, ethnic tensions that then overtake the island. So that's Plastic Emotions. And my motives for actually writing it were really my fascination with de Silva, and also my desire to write about that period of history in the history of Ceylon, and particularly that kind of 1950s, that post-colonial period really interested me. And her work kind of runs across that period and was a perfect perfect metaphor for me to use to explore the politics of that country.
Thanks so much, Leslie. It'd be great to hear from you a little bit about Feminist City and where it came from, your intentions and ambitions for the book.
Great, thank you, everyone, and thanks to all of you who are watching. So yes, my book, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, is a result of a desire to bring what I do for a living, which is to be a professor of urban geography and women's and gender studies, to a much wider audience. So I work at a small liberal arts type college on the east coast of Canada called Mount Allison. And so I live in this tiny college town called Sackville, 5,000 people, not the most urban environment or really urban at all, but that wasn't always the case. I was born in Toronto. I lived in and around Toronto and in London, UK for much of my life before coming here for work. And I was such a city lover, especially when I moved to downtown Toronto for university. And I really felt like the city was my home. I felt so much freedom and excitement, but of course also tempered with so many of those gendered concerns about safety and accessibility of urban space. But I didn't really kind of marry that with my interest in feminism until I went to grad school and heard of this cool thing called feminist geography that I had never heard of before. And all of a sudden, this whole world opened up to me in terms of seeing the ways that the environments around us, our built environments, especially like cities, are part of the power relations that shape gender, that shape class and race and sexuality and ability. And so it was this really cool extra layer, this literal third dimension for understanding how power worked. And that then just shaped the rest of my kind of academic trajectory through women's and gender studies and into urban geography. But I was really motivated, as I said, to write this book because those conversations that I have amongst my academic peers and with my students happen in a very specific sort of way. And it's kind of limited in terms of who gets to access those ideas. And I thought, there's so much about the way that the city shapes power relations that has come to feel very intuitive and very obvious to me, but I realize it's not that obvious to everyone else. So I thought maybe I can write a book and other people will, start to see the ways in which the spaces around us are contributing to all of these kind of social norms and social inequalities. So the book is kind of a combination then of drawing on all sorts of strands of feminist urban research over many decades and indeed over more than a century, but mixed in with sort of memoir and personal experience. So starting from my own experiences as a girl and woman in the city, not to kind of universalize my experience, but as entry points for saying, okay, if we start from everyday life, if we start from the struggle of carrying a stroller down the subway steps, or if we start from, the experience of how do you get home late at night and feel safe? What kinds of questions does that prompt us to ask about the city and about different kinds of lives and livelihoods in urban space? So the book kind of weaves those things together in what I hope is a more kind of accessible and engaging way of coming into this world of feminist urban geography and to thinking, again, then to open up possibilities for what might a feminist city look like, what would be some of the principles behind that. And I think some of that will come out in our conversation today. Thanks.
I'm so glad both of you took the time to write these books. So thank you for that. I think one of the commonalities that struck me was around this, I certainly identified as a city dweller during different phases of life with this marginalization and frustration and this kind of embodiment of urban trauma. I also identified as somebody who's worked with women in architecture with De Silva's frustration and marginalization and lack of voice and respect and all of those mixes of kind of I think I described it as irritating, but it was kind of making me aggressive. It was that moment where you're like, yes, and I'm angry about all of this. But also this thing that moved through that was this idea that, both kind of but that anger was kind of emblematic of this embodiment of the, of trauma or frustration that perhaps goes unacknowledged. And I think, Leslie, you wrote about how we have to return to the body to help us imagine alternatives. And you talk about, how people carry themselves in the city. And Shiromi, there's so much around De Silva and the body. I mean, both in her creation of architecture to fit a female body, and her conscious desire to do that, and also just in how you write of her consciously referring to the body and how she is dressing it, using it, carrying it in those scenes. So maybe I'll just start with you, Shiromi, to talk about the body in the book and what it represents, both in the context of her architecture and in the context of her physical embodiment in the book.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to go to a line in Leslie's book, actually, where she talks about the body as being a space where, it's gendered, class, race, and sexualized. That's where urban power relations and politics play out, right? And that really got me thinking about De Silva and how she actually just used her own body in I guess almost unexpected ways. So on the one hand, she played into the stereotype associated with the Asian female body at the time. She knew that, here she was, a brown woman in this white male-dominated profession of architecture. And however she moved through that profession, she would always be seen as this South Asian female with all of the kind of associations that brings. And if we remember that this was during not so long after the end of empire, and the kind of dominant stereotype of the Asian woman as this pliant woman, this sort of almost like Indian princess, South Asian princess type of thing. And De Silva kind of took this on and she really owned it. And she, was always seen, she actually branded herself almost in this way. She was seen in her saris, even when she was on an architectural building site, she was always in a sari. She always had a flower in her hair. She was always absolutely well turned out. And I bring this out in the book as well. But I know this for a fact because this is what everyone, when I interviewed people who actually knew her at the time, they always remarked on her appearance. So she used this, and I think in a way it was used to almost, well, in one sense, because she knew that this is how she would always be seen, she decided that she would just take that, seize it, and make it her own. On the other hand, it allowed her in a way to kind of, use a bit of sleight of hand, because at the end of the day, she was a very steely woman. She was very ambitious, and she had her own ideas about how modern architecture should be done, right? So I feel almost like it was a bit of camouflage that she used to then kind of bring out her own ideas. And those ideas, as she articulated them, were called, modern regionalism. And so it was this idea of kind of like bringing together modernist aesthetics, but sort of stripping away some of the aspects that just simply would not work in a tropical landscape. And so she fused that with the best and the most modern aspects of traditional architecture. And when I say traditional, I mean Sri Lankan traditional architecture, at least in Sri Lanka. But this idea and these principles could be applied across that part of the world. She was by no means the only person who had these ideas, but she was probably the first to actually, and the earliest to write those ideas down and articulate them as such. So, like I said, here is this body. And when you talk about the actual architecture that she created, again, she was acutely aware of who was using the building, what their needs were when she came to design and build for her clients. And certainly she was aware of how the female body inhabits the space, and therefore what ratios were necessary in certain rooms and certain spaces. So she was, yes, very much aware of the body, and certainly not even though she was, I guess, a student of Le Corbusier's in the sense that she was very much indebted to him and really admired him. She did not use the modular, which is, you know, his kind of system of ratios, which were totally based on the proportions of a man, and a very tall man at that. So yeah, that's just a very kind of a bit of an overview of this whole notion of the body and De Silva's architecture and De Silva herself.
Leslie, I think you speak so much about the what is imposed on women's bodies. Does that resonate with you? This idea of camouflage, how we might adopt postures or personas in the way that we navigate city spaces?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I was thinking about, you know, when Shiromi was mentioning that De Silva kind of knew that she would always be seen as the South Asian woman in the room or in the space, and that idea that in many ways anyone other than the kind of white cisgender able-bodied man has been the other to architecture and urban planning and urban design and urban policy. And, you know, Shiromi just described the ways in which De Silva tried to like work with and around that. And in a very everyday sense for women in the city, there's this constant, often subtle, but occasionally in your face reminder that you are the other, that you don't really belong there, that your presence in public space can be questioned. And it comes in everything from somebody commenting on what you're wearing to sort of smile, love, give us a smile, those kinds of things, to the more threatening aspects of harassment and danger. And also in the everyday barriers that women might face in terms of not being able to find a space to perform childcare, nursing activities, and so on. So yeah, in many ways, women are kind of asked to ignore their embodiment in order to actively participate in urban life, because the norm of urban life has been assumed to be a particular kind of body, and all other bodies are seen as, you know, afterthoughts or extraneous or problems for urban space. So in many ways, women's bodies, both their reproductive capacities, their health needs, their sexuality, their morality, have been cast as problems that cities have to kind of control, contain, take care of, and deal with in some way. So thinking about, if we started from a woman's body or a disabled body or an elderly body or, you know, a non-normative body, what other kinds of spaces might we come up with, or other ways of moving through the city or experiencing the city is, you know, one of the questions that I try to ask throughout the book.
So in a way, it's two kinds of modular man. There's the urban modular that's perhaps not exactly corpse, but still exists and is still used as a template for us to roll out these cities. And then the kind of literal Chandigarh, you know, an actual literal corpse, actual modular used to design spaces. But I know there are other modulars that you're both keen to discuss, and that is this the modular of the white supremacist, or there is a great quote, actually, Shiromi, you've got it there, so I'm going to get you to read it, but it's actually from Leslie's book, which I think is great. Having you read also each other's books is really a magical moment. So, but again, this, you know, protest figures highly in both books. There is this idea, a city, a place where there is, you know, discord. There is division, and there are people who are allowed to be there and people who aren't. But Shiromi, maybe I'll start with you, and you can read the quote that struck you from Leslie's book, and then go on to perhaps share and talk about in the context of the the Black Lives Matter movement and other protest movements, that other modular.
So yes, so this quote in Leslie's book, which is actually a quote from Jane Dark, who is a feminist geographer. And I just want to admit that I actually didn't know about feminist geography really until I read Leslie's book. It's kind of embarrassing to admit, but I've really learned about it now. So Jane Dark says, our cities are patriarchy written in stone, brick, glass, and concrete. And then later in the book, Leslie then says, that, yes, if our buildings are basically, patriarchy in concrete and brick, then the ground that we're walking on is, white supremacy. And I think, so this really struck me in the context of De Silva's work as well, because again, we have to look at that time, and that time was the post-colonial period. So we're looking at an architect, this is De Silva, coming to architecture as a person whose country had been colonized. And so there's a whole new dynamic there, right? Because you have these remnants, not remnants, but very strong, oh gosh, I'm very sorry that there's an ambulance in the background, but you have these very strong presence, this strong presence of empire and the colonial power, and that is there in the buildings, in the city that you're in, and in the country that you're living in. And I think De Silva really sort of radically kind of departed from that in a sense. And I really feel like her vision of this, modern regionalism or regional modern regionalism is very much like a way of kind of transcending that colonial dominance. And so when she talks about, bringing the landscape in, when she talks about bringing in, the artisan and the artist, and having them be part of the team that's actually, designing and building, this is her way of really reconnecting with the most modern aspects of Sri Lanka or Ceylon's traditional architecture, and really showing that it's a point of pride, really, as well. And I feel like that was quite a radical thing for her to do. And she's doing this all the while, at the same time, she's also kind of, constantly almost bowing down to Corb. So in the book, my novel has a lot of letters, a lot of correspondence between Le Corbusier and De Silva. And De Silva has this way of kind of flanneling Corb and, kind of talking about him as this great man. But at the same time, she is not afraid to, articulate these ideas, which are actually very much in opposition to his. And in fairness, he doesn't get upset by this. He's actually, impressed. So I kind of want to, I feel like this is, at its earliest, this is an example of how she vocalizes her ideas, and these are sort of an early indication of where her ideas are going. So this is early on in the novel. It's a letter that De Silva is writing to Le Corbusier. She's in London at the moment. She's studying at the Architectural Association, and she's thinking back to the moment where she met Corb. Now, in my novel, I write that they met at Bridgewater, which was an international conference of architects from around the world. But in actuality, she did meet him earlier. However, for the purposes of fiction narrative, I have had them meet at Bridgewater. So she's she's kind of thinking back to this, and she's remembering a moment during the conference. So this is June 1949. You were preoccupied. A fissure had opened up between the young and old architects. They were attacking you, Gropius, and the Athens Charter with its absolute separation of functions within a city. Who could deny the unique and radical needs of post-war urbanism? Who could still believe that a site was a blank slate upon which a plan and its architecture could be imposed? I have always wondered at the arrogance of supposing a place has no existence without a building installed according to a man-made plan. Sigiriya in Ceylon is exactly the opposite. It started with an enormous rock into which King Kashyapa carved himself and his entourage. It is the rock that stands out. The fortress, for indeed that is what it became, is barely visible, hinted at only in contours from afar. Its monumentality is drawn from its natural state. Closer inspection finds intricate claws and a staircase disappearing into the suggestion of a creature's gaping jaws, but all of this is hidden until you're close enough to touch it. The fortress was an island unto itself. Buddhist monks had once used it as an escape from this material world. Kashyapa came to it to escape certain death at the hands of his brother for killing their father. The fortress was always there, inherent in the rock, much as Michelangelo would find his sculptures buried in marble. So this, again, is this, for De Silva, it's the need to see the context, to see, where you are going to situate your build, as opposed to imposing the build on a landscape. So Korb talks about blank slates, De Silva talks about context, and I feel like that is very much related to her history as a colonized person.
Thank you for sharing that. I think what's interesting to me is this sense that she is she's subverting the system. She's using her body and her language. She's accepting being a little bird, or being diminutive, or being kind of an exotic creature, but she's using that and as part of her fight to kind of get her idea across, or communicate her ideas. And she is respected for those ideas in the novel, and I don't know in real life, but it certainly she was good. Leslie, I think something that struck me was in your chapter on protest, you make the point that there is no area of the city that has not been gained except through a fight, that we have to fight to take space, and every different non-white cis male group has had to fight to occupy. Heterosexual male has had to fight to take that space. Do you want to talk a little bit about City of Protest?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and maybe I'll just start by kind of picking up a little bit where Shiromi left off, thinking about colonialism and colonization. So in particular, because I'm writing from a Canadian context, primarily North American context, this is a settler colonial context, and often the settler colonial history and present of our cities is ignored, both by urban geographers in general, even feminist geographers, and certainly I think by most city planners and architects who, indigeneity is something that is long in the past or out in remote rural areas, and not something that we have to contend with in urban space. So I wanted to kind of think carefully about that as I was working on the book about the settler colonial context. And part of that also connects to this question of protest, because terms like Occupy, right? Occupy Wall Street, they are both metaphors, but also literal in terms of the fact that settler occupation of indigenous lands has not ended. And so there's something that we have to be kind of careful about when we think about occupation and reclaiming, like who are we taking from and who has already had something taken away from them. So that's just something that I always want to keep in mind. But at the same time, on a more positive note, I mean, we're definitely seeing right now the ways in which protest makes a difference. And in the book, as Christine mentions, I point out, like, nothing is sort of given to marginalized groups. Nobody just wakes up one day and says, oh yeah, it's time we gave you your rights. It's time we gave you voting. It's time you had space of your own, had equal access to education. That's not, how this works, right? People do have to fight for those things. And cities have always been sites where those social and political movements have gained so much force and power and critical mass. But often we're told protest doesn't work. Oh, that'll die down. You have to work with the system. You can't, be out there and be angry and blah, 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 blah. And we kind of forget that A, protest is the only thing that's really ever worked, and B, that protest can still work, right? And so we've seen this amazing moment of Black Lives Matter protests in many places in solidarity with Indigenous movements coming together to say we need to think really differently about this land that we're on, about the space that we're on, about histories of enslavement, about settler colonialism, and the ways in which those histories are still very much present in the spaces around us now.
Taking that into this, I mean, you end on the note of a city without master plans. This idea, and really that the idea of the master plan and the settler colonial idea are so closely related. And of course, Chandigarh is a master plan. So can we pick up a little bit on these notions of master plan? And I guess what's interesting for me with De Silva's approach is she doesn't quite get away from the master plan, but she does try to bring people into the making of that master plan. So she doesn't really abandon the idea of plan. Plan is very important to her. She is drafting, she's drawing. They're not kind of going to a site and improvising. But she is trying to, you depict her housing project as being very collaborative in its nature. She describes how she's the first one who's listened, and she's modified her approach to suit different cultures within that one project. And then also she's very angry with herself around the kitchen not being the right, not having been modified enough to suit its particular purpose. But she hasn't perhaps completely abandoned the idea of a national project or a kind of a nation building project intact. She hasn't escaped modernism completely. But anyway, over to you guys to talk about master plan and top down. Yeah.
So I guess part of me kind of almost wants to just read you a couple of passages from the novel, because they give you a kind of insight into the contrasting approaches that Corb and De Silva had in terms of this, in terms of their, their building, the principles with which they were approaching their building. So I think, of course, Corb, he's the kind of master of the master plan, and really very didactic about what should and should not happen in that. Design, everything should be sleek, modern, no plans. We don't want anything disrupting the lines, etc., etc. He's really mortified, by the suggestion of kind of tendrils of, vegetation kind of spilling over, the white walls. This is something he doesn't, he can't abide, and he wants the perfect glass sort of reflective pools. This is in Chandigarh. So he is by all means the very epitome of the master planner. Whereas, as Christine, as you said, De Silva is taking quite a different approach. So I'm going to just read these two passages because I think they illustrate the approaches really well. So this is an excerpt kind of like midway through the novel, and it's Le Corbusier. It's written from his point of view, and we're in kind of 1954, 55. And he's at a colleague's home, and this is an Indian colleague, and he's just observing the son of this colleague, this boy who is just running, and he's playing this game where he's sort of running with a wheel, and he's trying to keep the wheel up with a stick. The architect sees himself in the boy. He considers the wheel and finds he is chasing one of his own. Currently, he is preoccupied with creating the tapestries that will hang in the secretariat. Enormous, embroidered with new symbols that will speak across time. Elizabeth has suggested he create these symbols, showing him examples of work that she and Richard have done in Ghana. But the tapestries must be accepted by those who will work there, which the architect knows will not be easy. Beyond this, he is consumed by the pursuit of payment. After all, he must eat too. Having been wooed to take on this project of the new era, of the century even, he is forced to beg for his pitiful wage. Why should he have to beg? His demands are legitimate, his work is sound. Indeed, he is a member of the pantheon of 20th century greats. It is unthinkable that he should be treated in this way. He decides he will write to Nehru. But India is the land of slave labor, and the advantages of this policy are profound. Cheap labor yields flexibility of design. If the architect makes an error judging the rise of a wall, it is no problem. They can build it again. Not so in the West, where labor is dear and designs must be far more methodical and include all manner of contingencies. So here, thinks the architect, you put up with the goats nibbling grass in the middle of your site. You accept the children crouching on the periphery. You pay little attention to the cows that wander in and out of rubbled courtyards, leaving behind their shit. Why? Because if it isn't right the first time, you can try again and again until it is correct, without worrying about cost. This is the freedom of India for the architect, this concept of live design. Here, the architect can truly be an artist. And I just want to add that, okay, live design, but it's obviously designed to a plan. So now we go to 1956, and there is a letter that comes to Minette. This is a letter from Le Corbusier, and she's just picked it up. So the letter arrived in a plain envelope. This envelope is now in Minette's hand. She presses it between her fingers, feeling for its density, but finds paucity instead. The letter itself bears all the hallmarks of a well-written condolence. He is sorry for her loss. He is concerned for her friendships. How selfless, she thinks, slanting her eyes over her latest sketches. She appreciates his motives, but hasn't the time to reply. Her persistent advocacy has finally won her the contract she's always dreamed of, a social housing project. The Watapulua housing scheme for public servants near Kandy is sited along the banks of the Mahavali Ganga. With the Knuckles mountain range ascending in the distance, the site is nothing short of idyllic and a testament to the women who argued for the scheme to address the growing housing shortage. Their families represent a wide range of backgrounds. There are doctors, engineers, clerks, and others. That includes shopkeepers. They are Sinhalese, Tamil, Burgher, Malay, all with their own ways of living, their own demands. Having seen other housing schemes fail, Minette takes a different approach. She starts with the individual. She devises questionnaires to help determine the different householder types and thus building types that she will need to design. As always, the scheme must be economically viable. And Minette has already decided to use the site's natural slope to her advantage, minimizing the need to cut into the land. She has drawn up a detailed second questionnaire for all householders, so that she has a clear idea of more specific needs, such as movable walls that allow for the expansion of rooms for entertaining, or traditional outdoor kitchens. So I won't read further because we don't have that much time, but that just gives you an idea of the kind of contrast between the two, and how De Silva really did take a participatory approach, even to the point in some of her other builds, where indeed she worked with a fishing community and worked with them so that they would build their own houses. And I think that just says so much about how she really approached her approach to design and approach to building so that it would absolutely suit the people that were going to, live in those buildings. And I should also finally say that in reality, the housing association that settlement that she designed and built actually was very successful, and unfortunately was not replicated. So yeah.
Leslie, I thank you for sharing that. Leslie, I wanted to talk about a link a natural link for me there is your call for an intersectional team to deliver the city, as well as a different approach to the master plan. So can you talk a little bit about your vision for a feminist city in how it can be created without a master plan?
So one of the reasons that I would say that a notion of the feminist city should resist the idea of a master plan is that we don't want to end up just replacing this sort of narrow male figure with just as narrow a female figure and say, well, if we design around her, then everything will be fine. Sorry, there's some construction noise outside of my house right now. I apologize. And if we end up doing that, we're going to end up reproducing a lot of other kinds of inequalities and forms of discrimination in cities. So an intersectional approach is one that insists that gender is not the only or necessarily always the most important entry point to looking at issues of equality, equity, change, and so on, that actually we have to think about whenever we want to make an intervention to space or policy or whatever it might be, the ways in which it's going to affect people differently. And so one of the things to think about, or that I ask people to think about with the idea of the feminist city, is what if you start from the point of, the most marginalized in cities instead of the most privileged, right? What if you start from a point of view that is not typically taken into consideration? But of course, you need to start with many of those, right? Or to bring many of those together in order to have a sense of what the different needs of people are, their different desires, their different hopes and dreams and challenges. Kind of like what De Silva is doing when she actually, tries to speak to people about what kind of housing they want and what's important to them, rather than assuming that she knows what the end result should be. So in that sense, a much broader kind of active participation in city building is something that would be part of the feminist city, and an effort to make sure that we don't just start from privileged points of view and end up reproducing so many of the same problems and inequalities that have long existed.
So instead of a single machine for living in, or a single modular, you end up with this, plural. You begin with the plural and the intersectional. I want to make sure people are putting their questions into the questions. I'm going to pick up some of the comments and questions that have been put in there. So one of them is on the recent discussion in the UK in particular, but actually in the US as well, globally, on statues. So how relevant are the use of statues? How relevant is it to the discussion of a feminist city? Is it a discussion in the context of telling stories, of narrative in the city, written in bronze or stone? And I mean, really, whichever one of you wants to pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite important. I mean, one of the points that I make in Feminist City is the way in which we could see cities as kind of monuments to male power, and there are both, literal and symbolic representations of that. But of course, it's not just male power; it's colonial power, it's white supremacist power, it's heteronormative power. All these sorts of things are encoded in cities. And while we might say, well, it's just symbolic. Well, yes, but the symbolic is part of the picture, right? And as Christine said, the story that a city tells about itself, about its history, about its present, and about its future is kind of encoded in everything from our, street names and building names, public space names, to our statues and monuments. And if we shift that, then I think it does open space for changing the story that we tell, and for just letting people know, like, you are not other here. You are not less than, because in fact, that is what so many of those monuments are, both implicitly and in some cases very explicitly proclaiming.
I will throw in another question, unless Shiromi, do you want to address that one specifically? No, you're happy. I'm going to talk about, there's a question here about, is there any advice for women in the city? Is there a feminist way to thrive in the city or to work in the city? Shiromi, I want you to talk about your vision for De Silva's way of working within her context. And then Leslie, if you want to pick up, I think the question was directed at you, so they wanted to seek your advice on being a good feminist in the city.
Oh gosh, advice.
So I think, sorry, my question would be for you, just to riff on the question, if I may. It's around, would De Silva describe herself as a feminist in architecture?
Now that one is a difficult one because, you know, she lived in the, well, she was born in 1918. And I think a lot of people, you know, and we do see her as a feminist, but that is very much, you know, us taking a 20th, 21st century kind of, you know, idea and imposing it on her. If she was alive today, and I do know people who knew her well, they do say, yes, she probably would have described herself as a feminist, although, you know, as we know, feminism has many iterations, and I think hers might be potentially quite different from how we, you know, interpret feminism, and certainly my feminism might be different from someone else's in a different generation. So I think she certainly articulated her struggle as an architect, as a woman architect, in a using gender. So she did say many times that one of the big reasons why she did not gain the kind of fame that others did, and why her contribution as well to architecture is only kind of now sort of being recognized. I think, you know, all of those were very much down to the fact that she was a woman, and her need to, you know, actually even be paid was something that that clients found difficult, and I think again that is because she was a woman. So yes, I think she would see herself as feminist. However, I would caution here, because I don't think that her architecture necessarily is is feminist, if you know what I mean. She still kind of reproduced these gendered spaces, and she talked about them in that way, and that is because I think during that period, of course, you know, and particularly the 1950s, these gendered roles were really dominant. And even though she had broken through, I think nevertheless, what she was encountering were, generally speaking, people who conformed to the sort of traditional gendered roles. Today, however, if she was practicing today, I have no doubt that she would have, you know, moved beyond that, and, you know, would be responding to what she's seeing in the world. So in the same way that she was taking this participative approach to her design, I think she would have been seeing the changes in the world and actually adapting to those. And yeah, I mean, she was certainly, I think, you'd probably say she was a kind of eco-builder as well. And she would have taken that further, I think, had she lived longer. Yeah.
Leslie, it would be great to hear you respond. Is there a feminist way to thrive in the city?
Yes, thanks for the question. Hi, Ashley. The best answer that I found for that in my own experience, and this really came home for me just as I was writing the book, was the ways in which engaging in some form of activism and protest has been so important for me to feel a sense of belonging in the city and to contributing to something bigger than myself. So whether that is, you know, going to your Black Lives Matter march, participating in climate change actions or any other kinds of social movements that are happening. To me, literally like being on the street, speaking truth to power, being visible is so important when, of course, it is accessible and available to you to do so. And the other thing that I would say, and this one I struggle with more because, you know, again, the form of the city just doesn't make it really easy, is to think about what other kinds of social relations and social networks can we create? So we're kind of pushed into this sort of single family model. Romantic partnership is the most important partnership, and you live your life in that bubble with your intimate partner and so on. But what other ways can we imagine? You know, I talk in the book about friendship, and that is just kind of one way of imagining other sorts of kinship relationships that we could develop that I think would, you know, redistribute care work and shift so many of the things that make urban life not so great for women. So yeah, activism and changing our social household family relations would be my short answers.
Can I add to that? You have an interesting passage on fear and talking about being brave and not saying, oh, I was stupid, I went out late at night, or I came back home, but actually saying, you know, I overcame the fear that I have embodied to be in the city.
Yeah.
So Shiromi, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, honestly, go ahead.
Shiromi, I wanted to ask you about, there is a servant in the household with De Silva, and that relationship kind of adds another dimension to and complicates the narrative of course, of colonialism or post-colonialism in the book. Do you want to talk about that relationship?
Yes. Well, the thing that is absolutely clear about De Silva is that she was a privileged elite. She was an elite. She lived in a certain bubble of her own. And yes, she had certain struggles, but at the same time, she was able to live a certain kind of life. That is to say, she never married. She had affairs with various men, and she was quite progressive, really, at that period of time. But she was able to do that, I think, because she occupied a certain class of society. So I wanted to really explore and give voice to another class of society, and Jaya, who is the housemaid, gave me that kind of opportunity to try to give voice, where because I wanted to kind of balance out this very, really frankly, kind of elitist book, because it is quite elite. It deals with these very famous people, but Jaya's kind of quite, she comes from the village, and she's also, what is noticeable about her is that she's also very dark-skinned, and in South Asian society there's a lot of colorism, and of course and discrimination, and so there is this hierarchy that exists where the fairer skinned people tend to be considered to be more beautiful, but Jaya hasn't really, she hasn't like absorbed this or this particular prejudice, and she's very proud of her skin color. She's proud of her strength as a woman, and it was important to me to present someone like her, who is a formidable woman in and of herself. So while she is, there, and she is the servant, she still also has a certain degree of control. And you do see, De Silva kind of in one scene sort of hiding the fact that she's smoking a cigarette because she doesn't want to be told off by Jaya. And there are other things, other aspects where De Silva will modify her behavior because she doesn't want Jaya to think ill of her. So that's interesting to me because, of course, and this is not, honestly, this is not just a fiction. I think people really do, to some extent, behave this way. When I read this, of a certain passage which included Jaya in Sri Lanka. I went out there and I read a kind of preview of the book. Someone came up to me and said, "Oh my God, that was absolutely true. We do. There is this certain fear of being judged by the people who are working within your household." So Jaya is, she occupies this interesting space. And while she, as I said, she does have a certain degree of control, there's also a number of aspects of which she has no control over. And I don't want to give all of that away. But yeah, she was one voice that I really, really enjoyed actually writing.
One of the things that resonated with Jaya's story and with Leslie's book is that she's also a victim of domestic violence who's escaped a very dangerous and toxic relationship. And she feels so liberated to have escaped from that and to be in this safe space. And I think that there's a lot of that idea of you very openly, Leslie, discuss domestic violence and that kind of private sphere and how it can be so toxic and so dangerous to so many women, and how we kind of project that onto the city. I want to pick up another question from one of the people watching, Luke Burton, and that's about whether this is the ideas in your book are about current city so much, or are you really about imagining a city for the future?
Thanks for that question. No, it's not just about the future. In fact, women have been designing their own ideas for homes and cities and suburbs, and not just architects like De Silva, but just everyday women for well over a century. And some of those visions have come to pass, maybe not existing for terribly long periods of time, but they certainly have happened. And I would challenge anybody in any city that you're living in that you can find these little pockets of places that are living some principles of a feminist city, which would be places where, care work is shared and distributed amongst people in society, where fear and safety are prioritized, but not through increased policing, where public space is open to all sorts of different people. So I think that there are examples. Sometimes they're kind of fleeting. Sometimes they are more about the relations that people are creating than about physical spaces, because the built environment is durable, right? It's hard to change in a short period of time. And so sometimes we have to appropriate and use spaces in ways that they were not intended or imagined by architects and planners to be used. So to me, it's sometimes about looking in the cracks. And, right now I think about in the time of COVID, this sort of what some people have called caremongering. So collectives of people that are taking care of their neighborhood by delivering food to people in need, by sharing childcare, by growing food for one another. And those things are not entirely new, but they have increased visibility right now. And I think we can look to those as examples, small scale though they might be, but as ways that we can imagine feminist cities just already existing right here amongst us.
We've just got a couple minutes left, so I wanted to put this final question, which is around the smart city. I think these ideas of surveillance about the body being owned externally, but also, Leslie, you talk about the Nextdoor app. Obviously, this isn't picked up in Plastic Emotions, but I'd be interested in your take on it too, Shiromi, and how whether you have impressions about the ways in which technology is changing the city. Well, Leslie, you go first.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there's feminist examples or examples that are kind of drawn from feminist concerns. So like safety related apps, ways in which women can report harassment, for example, or can communally or collectively track safety concerns in their urban environments. And different people there's a safety pin app, for example, is one of these, and also apps that allow women to covertly sort of contact domestic violence organizations in case their phones are being monitored by their partners, these sorts of things. But on the other hand, we know that surveillance technology tends to be used to the benefit of those who are in power rather than those who are not in power. So questions around the smart city really do have to engage deeply with these social questions and with feminist and anti-racist and indigenous perspectives and perspectives from the disability community to really make sure that they're not going to just, reproduce problematic power and policing kinds of practices.
I mean, I think the only thing I would say on this, and I don't know whether this is the smart city, but just thinking about like citizen journalism and just the fact that everyone has a smartphone, and therefore there is a way for people, particularly, people of color, to provide witness to the kinds of abuses of power that happen. And so I'm talking about like the video footage that you're seeing of racist policing, and I feel like that is something that potentially could be really transformative. It already is very transformative because it's allowed, it's given the kind of social proof that one requires when you are building a movement and when you're expanding your movement and your protest. So perhaps there'll be something that follows that. I don't know. This is a very off the cuff response, but that's the one big thing that I think we have anyway at the moment in our hands and in our power to help change these power dynamics, or at least to survey them back, as it were.
And tell stories. And I mean, I guess this is kind of the wrap-up conclusion, but thank you both for telling these new stories about architecture in the city, and these and women within them as well, and giving us new narratives and ways to talk about our bodies and our place, and explore, giving us the opportunity to explore those frustrations, and also explore opportunities for difference and new ways forward. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes.